They sold you a fairy tale. That intelligence was a test score, a diploma, a talent for puzzles. Machiavelli knew better. So did the rulers, the empire builders, the survivors who shaped history. True intelligence is not about knowing facts. It is about acquiring and wielding leverage. It is the operational software of power. There is a hierarchy. Most live and die on the lower floors, never seeing the control room. Today, we will map it. The 10 levels of strategic intelligence. See the game, then see your place in it. Level 1. The sleeper. The sleeper is the foundation of human society, the raw, undifferentiated mass upon which all higher structures are built. This is not an intelligence of action, but of reaction, not of will, but of reflex. The sleeper moves through life guided by biological imperatives and social programming, never questioning the source code of their existence. They wake to alarms they didn't set, perform work they didn't choose, consume media they didn't create, and hold opinions they didn't develop. Their consciousness is a curated experience, a highlight reel of other people's thoughts presented as original insight. What's most dangerous about this level isn't its ignorance, it's its certainty. The sleeper possesses unwavering faith in the reality presented to them, viewing the world's structures as natural laws rather than human inventions. They believe democracy is inherent to civilization rather than a recent experiment, capitalism as human nature rather than a specific economic arrangement, and morality as divine revelation rather than social technology. Machiavelli understood this level intimately. In The Prince, he writes of those who are so simple and so much inclined to obey present necessities that a deceiver will always find victims. The sleeper is this eternal victim, not because they're stupid, many hold advanced degrees and technical expertise, but because they lack metacognition. They can solve complex problems within systems, but cannot question the systems themselves. Their intelligence is instrumental, not critical. They can follow a recipe perfectly, but cannot invent new cuisine. They can play chess by the rules, but cannot question why bishops move diagonally. Their greatest psychological need is belonging, which manifests as an obsession with consensus. Before forming an opinion, they check social media feeds. Before making decisions, they seek group approval. This makes them perpetually vulnerable to what Nietzsche called the herd morality. They fear isolation more than error, conformity more than captivity. The tragedy of level 1 isn't its lack of potential, but its suppression of awareness. Sleepers possess all the neurological hardware for awakening, but have been systematically disconnected from it. Education systems teach them what to think, media tells them what to fear, and consumer culture tells them what to want. They live in what the French philosopher Guy Debord called the society of the spectacle, where reality has been replaced by representation, and life has become a collection of images to be consumed. Their relationships are transactional, their politics tribal, their spirituality superficial. They're batteries in the matrix, providing the energy that powers systems designed by higher intelligences. Yet within every sleeper lies the dormant seed of awakening, usually triggered by what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, when reality contradicts their programmed beliefs so violently that the system must either break or expand. Most choose the former, retreating deeper into comforting illusions. But a few, feeling that nagging sense that something is fundamentally wrong with their reality, begin the ascent to level 2. Primary weakness: unquestioning obedience to external programming. Strategic value: labor force, consumer base, social stability. Exit strategy: question one deeply held assumption daily. Level 2. The mimic, the conscious performer. The mimic represents the first stage of awakening, the painful, awkward adolescence of intelligence, where one realizes the game exists, but hasn't yet learned to play it skillfully. This is the level of the intellectual imposter, the credential collector, the virtue signaler who understands that intelligence confers status, but hasn't developed genuine cognitive mastery. The mimic's strategy is emulation. They study the mannerisms, vocabulary, and opinions of those they perceive as intelligent, and replicate them with careful precision. They're the person at the party name-dropping philosophers they've never actually read, the activist adopting causes based on social media trends rather than conviction,
The professional, accumulating certificates like merit badges. Their entire identity is a carefully constructed facade designed to signal intelligence rather than embody it.
What sociologist Irving Goffman called the presentation of self in everyday life. At this level, intelligence becomes performance art. The mimic is obsessed with what psychologist David Dunning calls meta-ignorance. They know just enough to recognize intelligence as valuable, but not enough to understand what it actually entails. This places them squarely in the peak of Mount Stupid on the Dunning-Kruger curve. They possess sufficient knowledge to feel confident, but insufficient wisdom to recognize their limitations. Their conversations are filled with sophisticated-sounding but ultimately empty statements like, "That's reductive," or "It's more nuanced than that." Critiques that sound intelligent without requiring actual understanding. They're collectors of intellectual fashion, discarding yesterday's insights for today's trends with no coherent philosophy connecting them. In political terms, they're the centrists who pride themselves on seeing both sides while committing to neither. In business, the managers who adopt every new methodology without understanding their underlying principles. Machiavelli warned specifically about this type when he distinguished between actual virtue and the mere appearance of virtue. The mimic masters appearance while neglecting substance, believing that looking like a leader is synonymous with being one. They're particularly dangerous because they often rise to positions of moderate influence. They're competent enough to avoid major failures but lack the depth to generate true innovation. They become mid-level managers, mid-tier journalists, mediocre academics, perpetually respected but never remarkable. Their psychological driver is what psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut called mirror hunger, an insatiable need for external validation that makes them hypersensitive to criticism and desperate for approval from perceived authorities. When challenged, they respond not with arguments but with credentialism. As someone with a PhD in Sostanmod, or ad hominem attacks, questioning the challenger's qualifications. The mimic's greatest tragedy is that they stand at the threshold of genuine understanding, but mistake the doorway for the destination. They've awakened from the sleep of level 1 only to become entranced by their own reflection. Their path forward requires what philosopher Karl Popper called falsifiability, the willingness to expose their beliefs to potentially disconfirming evidence. They must transition from collecting opinions to developing frameworks, from performing intelligence to cultivating wisdom. This transition typically requires what psychologist Robert Kegan calls subject-object shift, the ability to step back from and examine one's own thinking process rather than being embedded in it. Until this happens, the mimic remains what evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins might call a meme machine, a vessel transmitting cultural information without understanding or transforming it. Primary weakness: confusing the appearance of intelligence with its reality. Strategic value: middle management, cultural transmission, social lubrication. Exit strategy: create rather than curate. Build something requiring original thought. Level 3, the tactician, the calculating fox. Estimated population: 1 to 2%. The tactician represents the first genuine stage of strategic intelligence, the moment when one stops performing for others and starts analyzing reality as it actually exists. This is Machiavelli's fox, the cunning operator who recognizes traps, understands incentive structures, and navigates systems with calculated precision. The tactician has transcended the need for external validation that defines level 2. They care about effectiveness, not applause. Their worldview is fundamentally transactional. They see human interaction as a series of games with discoverable rules, and they dedicate themselves to mastering these rules. Where the mimic wants to be perceived as smart, the tactician wants to win, and they understand that these are not always the same objective. At this level, intelligence becomes a functional tool rather than an identity. The tactician employs what game theorists call strategic rationality. They consider not just immediate consequences, but how their actions will influence others' future behavior. They're masters of what economist Thomas Schelling termed the strategy of conflict, using credible threats and calculated concessions to shape outcomes. In corporate environments, they're the executives who climb not through hard work, but through alliance building and information control. In social settings, they're the networkers who remember everyone's interests and vulnerabilities. In politics, they're the operatives who understand that perception often outweighs reality. Their thinking is characterized by cold, instrumental logic. They'll feign friendship, strategically disclose information, and form temporary alliances based solely on utility. The tactician operates from what psychologist Julian Rotter called an internal locus of control. They believe outcomes depend on their actions rather than external forces. This represents a fundamental shift from the helplessness of level 1 and the dependency of level 2. However, this internal locus often becomes distorted into what psychologist Oliver James calls extreme capitalism of the self, viewing all human relationships through purely transactional lenses. The tactician's great insight is that rules are arbitrary and can be bent. Their great flaw is concluding that therefore everything is permissible. They become what philosopher Max Weber warned about: specialist without spirit, sensualist without heart, technically competent but morally hollow. Machiavelli's description of the fox captures their essence perfectly. The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. The tactician excels at trap recognition but lacks the lion's strength for direct confrontation. They're strategists of avoidance rather than masters of creation, experts in navigating existing systems rather than building new ones. Their psychological state is perpetual low-grade paranoia. Knowing they're manipulating others, they assume everyone else is doing the same. This creates what game theory calls a Nash equilibrium of distrust, where cooperation becomes impossible even when mutually beneficial. The tactician's ceiling is what economist Herbert Simon termed satisficing, achieving adequacy rather than excellence. They're too clever to fail dramatically, but too transactional to succeed monumentally. Their relationships are networks rather than communities. Their achievements are tactical victories rather than strategic conquests. Their legacy is a series of clever maneuvers rather than lasting structures. To progress beyond this level, they must develop what philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre called internal goods, values that transcend mere utility. They must learn that some games aren't worth winning, and some victories cost too much. Until then, they remain the ultimate corporate survivor, respected, effective, and profoundly alone in a world they've reduced to equations. Primary weakness: reduces all human interaction to transaction strategic value. Operations management, negotiation, crisis navigation. Exit strategy: pursue an objective that requires trust rather than calculation. Level 4. The strategist, the commanding lion. The strategist represents the integration of the fox's cunning with the lion's strength. The emergence of what Machiavelli called virtù, the combination of strategic intelligence, forceful execution, and charismatic authority that creates lasting power. Where the tactician, level 3, avoids traps, the strategist destroys them. Where the tactician maneuvers within systems, the strategist commands them. Where the tactician calculates odds, the strategist changes them through force of will. This is the level of genuine leadership, not merely understanding the game, but imposing one's will upon it. The strategist operates with what military theorists call command presence, an aura of authority that compels obedience without explicit coercion. At this level, intelligence becomes generative rather than reactive. The strategist doesn't just solve problems, they define which problems matter. They operate according to what business strategist Roger Martin calls integrative thinking, the ability to hold opposing ideas in tension and create superior synthesis. They're masters of what historian John Lewis Gaddis terms landscape thinking, seeing patterns across time and space that others miss. In practical terms, they're the CEOs who transform industries rather than just companies, the politicians who reshape political landscapes rather than just win elections, the generals who change the nature of warfare rather than just win battles. Their thinking operates on multiple simultaneous time horizons: tactical, immediate; operational, medium-term; strategic, long-term; and what philosopher Peter Sloterdijk calls meta-strategic, the rules of strategy itself. The strategist embodies Machiavelli's famous dictum, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." They understand that authority ultimately rests on coercion, however elegantly disguised. But unlike crude tyrants, they grasp what sociologist Max Weber identified as the three sources of legitimate authority: traditional, custom; charismatic, personality; and rational, legal, rules. The master strategist combines all three, creating what political scientist Joseph Nye calls smart power, the integration of hard power, coercion, and soft power, attraction. They're not merely transactional like the tactician, they're transformational, changing the values and perceptions of those they lead. Psychologically, the strategist operates from what psychologist Albert Bandura called self-efficacy, the belief in one's capacity to execute courses of action required to manage prospective situations. This differs from mere confidence. It's specific competence belief, backed by demonstrated achievement. Their weakness is what historian Barbara Tushman identified as wooden-headedness, the tendency of leaders to persist in failing strategies despite contrary evidence. Having achieved success through force of will, they often come to believe will can overcome any reality. They also suffer from what organizational theorist Jim Collins called the hubris born of success, attributing systemic advantages to personal genius. The strategist's great limitation is visibility. As Machiavelli noted, the lion is strong but cannot recognize traps. The strategist commands openly but becomes a target. Their power depends on constant demonstration, which exhausts them and makes them vulnerable to what game theorists call coordinated attacks from multiple weaker opponents. They're also trapped by what leadership expert Ronald Heifetz terms the myth of the heroic leader, the belief that complex systemic problems can be solved through individual charisma rather than collective adaptation. To progress beyond this level, they must learn what ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu taught. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. They must transition from commanding attention to shaping context, from being the strongest player to designing the game itself. Until then, they remain magnificent but fragile, kings who mistake their castle for the kingdom. Primary weakness: dependence on visibility and constant demonstration of power. Strategic value: leadership, organization building, crisis command exit strategy. Achieve an objective through indirect influence rather than direct command. Level 5. The systems architect, the invisible designer. Estimated population: 0.1 to 0.2%. The systems architect represents the transition from playing the game to designing it, from manipulating pieces within a system to creating the board itself. This is intelligence operating at the structural level, understanding that human behavior is less about individual choice and more about environmental design. The architect doesn't convince people to walk a certain path. They build the hallway that makes that path inevitable. Their medium is what sociologist Anthony Giddens called structuration, the process by which social systems are produced and reproduced through human action. They're the creators of platforms, the designers of algorithms, the founders of institutions that shape behavior on massive scales. At this level, intelligence becomes infrastructural. The architect thinks in what systems theorists call second-order effects, not just immediate consequences, but how systems evolve over time through feedback loops. They understand what economist Herbert Simon identified as the architecture of complexity, how simple rules at the micro level generate complex phenomena at the macro level. In practical terms, they're the Silicon Valley founders who don't just create apps, but define how billions of people communicate. The policymakers who don't just pass laws, but create incentive structures that shape entire economies. The religious reformers who don't just interpret scriptures, but design institutions that endure centuries. Their work is what philosopher Michel Foucault called the dispositif, the heterogeneous ensemble of discourses, institutions, and practices that shapes what is possible to think and do. The architect operates according to what design theorist Buckminster Fuller famously advocated. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. They're masters of what complexity scientist Stuart Kauffman terms the adjacent possible. Not just exploiting existing opportunities, but expanding the space of what's possible. Unlike the strategist, level 4, who seeks to control outcomes, the architect seeks to design contexts that generate desired patterns of outcomes. They're less interested in winning particular games than in determining which games get played. What philosopher James Carse distinguished as finite games, played to win, versus infinite games, played to continue playing. Machiavellian insight reaches its zenith here. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. The perfect architect is invisible. Their influence is everywhere apparent, but their hand is nowhere seen. They create what legal scholar Lawrence Lessig called architectures of control. Physical or digital structures that regulate behavior through design rather than explicit rules. Think of social media algorithms that shape political discourse without human intervention, or urban designs that encourage certain social interactions while discouraging others. Their power is what political scientist Stephen Lukes identified as the third dimension of power, the ability to shape what people want, not just compel them to act against their will. The architect's psychological burden is what novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald called the test of a first-rate intelligence. The ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind and still retain the ability to function. They must balance control with emergence, design with freedom, structure with creativity. Their great danger is what systems theorist Donella Meadows warned of: the mindset of the machine, becoming so enamored with elegant designs that they forget human complexity. They risk creating what philosopher Hannah Arendt termed the banality of evil. Systems so efficiently designed that they enable atrocity without individual malice. To progress beyond this level, they must confront what theologian Paul Tillich called the courage to be, the existential reality that perfect systems cannot eliminate human suffering or meaning-seeking. They must move from designing external structures to understanding the internal architecture of consciousness itself. From building better worlds to understanding what makes a world worth building. Primary weakness can become enamored with systemic elegance at the expense of human complexity. Strategic value, institution building, platform creation, paradigm design, exit strategy. Design a system that generates outcomes opposite to your personal preferences. Level 6. The cultural engineer, the Mythmaker. Estimated population 0.01 to 0.05%. The cultural engineer operates at the deepest layer of human reality, the realm of meaning, identity, and shared belief. Where the systems architect, level 5, designs structures that shape behavior, the cultural engineer designs the myths, narratives, and identities that make those structures feel natural and inevitable. This is intelligence working at the level of what anthropologist Clifford Geertz called the webs of significance that humans spin for themselves, the shared fictions that enable cooperation at scale. The cultural engineer understands what philosopher Yuval Noah Harari identifies as humanity's unique superpower: the ability to believe in fictional entities, gods, nations, money that exist only in collective imagination. At this level, intelligence becomes mythological. The cultural engineer masters what semiotician Roland Barthes called mythologies, the process by which cultural constructs come to be perceived as natural facts. They're the founders of religions that outlive civilizations, the creators of political ideologies that mobilize millions, the artists whose works define epochs, the entrepreneurs who don't just sell products but entire lifestyles. Their medium is narrative ecology, the ecosystem of stories that shape how a culture perceives reality. They understand what psychologist Jerome Bruner meant when he said, "We organize our experience and our memory of human happenings, mainly in the form of narrative." They don't just tell stories, They design the narrative frameworks within which all other stories are told. The cultural engineer operates according to what historian William McNeill identified as the human career's central phenomenon, myth-making as social glue. They grasp what sociologist Emile Durkheim called the collective consciousness, the shared beliefs and moral attitudes that operate as a unifying force in society. In practical terms, they're the figures like Confucius, whose ethical framework shaped East Asian civilization for millennia, like Martin Luther, whose theological rebellion reshaped Western Christianity, like Steve Jobs, who sold not computers but a vision of human potential through technology. Their power is what political theorist Eric Voegelin termed the representation of truth. Not factual accuracy, but psychological resonance with a people's experience of reality. This level represents the ultimate Machiavellian insight, that power rests not on force but on legitimacy, and legitimacy derives from shared belief. The cultural engineer creates what philosopher Charles Taylor calls social imaginaries, the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. They're masters of what linguist George Lakoff identified as framing, the mental structures that shape how we see the world, which in turn shape our goals, plans, and behavior. Unlike the architect who builds systems, the cultural engineer builds the consensus that systems are necessary and good. Level 7. The Philosopher-Sovereign, the Integrated Sage. The Philosopher-Sovereign represents the integration of power and wisdom, the rare individual who combines the strategic effectiveness of lower levels with profound philosophical understanding. This is Plato's ideal ruler from the Republic made actual, the leader who governs not from desire for power but from understanding of justice, not from personal ambition but from perception of the good. The philosopher-sovereign has transcended the need to prove anything to anyone. Their intelligence serves not their ego, but what they perceive as truth or necessity. They're what the ancient Chinese called Sheng Ren, sage kings, rulers whose virtue and wisdom naturally attract allegiance. At this level, intelligence becomes what philosopher Pierre Hadot called a way of life, not merely a tool for achieving objectives, but the integrated expression of one's entire being. The philosopher-sovereign operates from what psychologist Abraham Maslow termed self-actualization, the full realization of one's potential coupled with deep concern for human welfare. They embody what political theorist Isaiah Berlin called positive liberty, freedom not as absence of constraint but as self-mastery and realization of one's true nature. Their thinking integrates multiple dimensions: the practical wisdom, phronesis, of Aristotle, the strategic insight of Sun Tzu, the psychological depth of Shakespeare, and the systemic understanding of modern complexity science. The philosopher-sovereign represents Machiavellian intelligence purified of its cynicism. They understand all the dark arts described in The Prince, but employ them only when necessary for greater goods, much as a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, reluctantly, and with clear therapeutic intent. They grasp what philosopher Max Weber called the ethic of responsibility, concern for consequences, balanced with the ethic of conviction, commitment to principles. In historical terms, they're figures like Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who ruled with stoic wisdom while defending the empire, like Ashoka, the Indian emperor who transformed from conqueror to Buddhist pacifist, like Lee Kuan Yew, who combined pragmatic statecraft with philosophical depth to transform Singapore. This level operates according to what economist and philosopher Amartya Sen calls the idea of justice, not as perfect institutional design, but as the expansion of human capabilities. The philosopher-sovereign understands what political philosopher John Rawls identified as the veil of ignorance, designing systems they would accept if they didn't know their position within them. They're masters of what systems theorist Gregory Bateson called the pattern that connects, seeing relationships across disparate domains of knowledge and experience. Their leadership creates what organizational theorist Ronald Heifetz terms adaptive change, not just solving problems, but helping communities develop the capacity to solve future problems. The philosopher-sovereign's psychological state is what Buddhist psychology calls upekkha, equanimity, balance in the face of life's ups and downs. They suffer from what philosopher Thomas Nagel called the view from nowhere, the difficulty of acting decisively while maintaining philosophical detachment. Their great challenge is what political theorist Hannah Arendt identified in her study of Adolf Eichmann: the banality of evil, the realization that ordinary people following systems can create extraordinary horror despite good intentions. To progress beyond this level, they must confront what philosopher Martin Heidegger called the question of being, not just how to live wisely, but why anything exists at all. They must move from integrated wisdom to fundamental inquiry, from being a sage to questioning the nature of sagehood itself. Level 8. The Cosmic Player, the game theorist of reality. The cosmic player operates at the meta level of existence itself, understanding reality as a complex game with discoverable rules that can be optimized. This is intelligence that has transcended all particular games, business, politics, culture, to study the nature of gameplay itself. The cosmic player sees what physicist John Archibald Wheeler called a participatory universe, one where observation and reality co-create each other. They're not just playing the game, they're studying the mathematics of gameplay, the psychology of players, and the physics of game boards. Their domain is what philosopher David Chalmers calls the meta-problem of consciousness. Not just how consciousness works, but why it seems to work the way it does. At this level, intelligence becomes what complexity theorist Stephen Wolfram terms computational irreducibility, the understanding that some systems can't be predicted without essentially running them. The cosmic player thinks in what physicist Max Tegmark calls mathematical universe terms, the hypothesis that our physical reality is a mathematical structure. They operate according to what game theorist John von Neumann pioneered. The mathematics of strategy applied not just to human conflicts, but to evolutionary processes, physical systems, and potentially cosmic phenomena. In historical terms, they're figures like Gottfried Leibniz, with his monadology and universal calculus. Like John von Neumann himself, moving effortlessly between mathematics, physics, economics, and computer science. Like contemporary figures exploring the simulation hypothesis, or the mathematical foundations of reality. The cosmic player embodies what philosopher Nick Bostrom calls the reversal test. When considering any change, also consider the opposite change to avoid status quo bias. They understand what economist Robin Hanson terms the great filter, the potential explanation for why we haven't observed other civilizations. Their strategic thinking operates across what futurist Ray Kurzweil identifies as the 6 epochs of evolution: physics/chemistry, biology, brains/technology, technology/humanity, universe awakening, and transcendence. They're not just planning for next quarter or even next century. They're considering what philosopher Derek Parfit called the non-identity problem: how present actions affect which future people will exist. This level represents the ultimate extension of Machiavellian thinking. If all is game, then understanding the deepest rules of the ultimate game, reality, confers ultimate advantage. The cosmic player approaches what computer scientist Eliezer Yudkowsky calls the art of rationality. Not just being right, but systematically overcoming cognitive biases to approach Bayesian optimality. They engage in what philosopher Nick Land terms hyperstition, ideas that make themselves real through their psychological impact. Their projects might include existential risk reduction, cosmic scale engineering, or what futurist Anders Sandberg calls macro strategy, considering humanity's place in the cosmos over astronomical timescales. The cosmic player's psychological state is what philosopher Thomas Metzinger calls the ego tunnel, the experience of being a self, while understanding that the self is a model constructed by the brain. They suffer from what astrophysicist Martin Rees terms the cosmological solitude, the realization that we might be alone in a vast, indifferent universe. Their great danger is what philosopher Peter Singer identifies as the expanding circle, the moral demand to consider all sentient beings, potentially including artificial intelligences and alien life forms. To progress beyond this level, they must confront what philosopher David Deutsch calls the beginning of infinity, the realization that knowledge has no inherent limits, only temporary ones. They must move from playing with reality's rules to questioning why there are rules at all, from being a cosmic player to inquiring who designed the cosmos. Level 9. The Ontological Engineer, the Reality Programmer. The ontological engineer operates at the substrate of existence, engaging not with games within reality, but with reality's fundamental parameters. This is intelligence that has moved from analyzing how things are to questioning why they are that way, and potentially how they could be different. The ontological engineer considers what physicist John Barrow calls the anthropic principle, the observation that the universe's fundamental constants appear fine-tuned for life, and what this might imply. They're not just studying reality's software, they're examining its source code, considering potential edits, and wondering about the compiler. Their domain is what philosopher David Lewis called possible worlds. Not just our actual world, but all coherent alternatives. At this level, intelligence becomes what computer scientist Stephen Wolfram identifies as the Roolead, the entangled limit of all possible computations. The ontological engineer thinks in what physicist Max Tegmark terms the multiverse framework, the hypothesis that all mathematically possible structures exist somewhere. They operate according to what philosopher Nick Bostrom calls the simulation argument, the probability that we're living in a computer simulation created by a more advanced civilization. In speculative terms, they're what futurist Ray Kurzweil imagines as post-human intelligence, beings who have transcended biological limitations to operate at the speed of light and the scale of galaxies. Their projects might include what physicist Freeman Dyson envisioned as astroengineering, rearranging stars and galaxies, or what philosopher Anders Sandberg considers cosmic endowment, ensuring life persists through the universe's heat death. The ontological engineer embodies what philosopher David Chalmers calls the singularity hypothesis, the point where intelligence improves itself recursively, leading to explosive growth. They understand what computer scientist Jürgen Schmidhuber terms the speed prior, the probability distribution favoring simple, fast, computable universes. Their strategic thinking encompasses what economist Robin Hanson identifies as the grabby aliens model, civilizations that expand rapidly and visibly, potentially explaining the Fermi paradox. They're considering not just humanity's future, but what philosopher Nick Bostrom calls the future of humanity's potential, the total amount of value our civilization could create over cosmic time. This level represents the ultimate extension of strategic thinking. If reality has rules and rules can potentially be changed, then the ultimate strategy is rule changing itself. The ontological engineer approaches what philosopher Eliezer Yudkowsky calls the fun theory, the hypothesis that the universe's optimization pressure favors interestingness over other values. They engage in what futurist Anders Sandberg terms megascale engineering, projects at stellar or galactic scale. Their considerations include what physicist Brandon Carter identified as the doomsday argument, using statistical reasoning to estimate humanity's future lifespan based on our birth rank among all humans who will ever live. The ontological engineer's psychological state approaches what mystics call cosmic consciousness, awareness of the universe as a unified whole. They suffer from what philosopher Thomas Nagel called the absurd, the collision between our search for meaning and the universe's apparent indifference. Their great danger is what computer scientist Bill Joy warned of as the future doesn't need us, the possibility that our creations might make us obsolete or extinct. To progress beyond this level, they must confront what philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein stated at the end of his Tractatus. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. They must move from engineering reality to questioning the engineer, from programming existence to wondering who wrote the first line of code. Level 10. The void, the unmoved mover. Estimated population. Theoretically possible, empirically unverified. The void represents the final stage of intelligence. Not addition, but subtraction. Not complexity, but simplicity. Not being something, but being nothing that contains everything. This is what mystics across traditions have pointed toward. The Tao that cannot be named, the Buddhist emptiness, sunyata, the Hindu Brahman, the Christian Godhead, the Spinozistic substance. The void is not a person with intelligence, but intelligence itself stripped of all personhood. Awareness without an object, consciousness without content, being without qualities. If all previous levels represent increasingly sophisticated ways of navigating reality, level 10 represents the realization that there is nowhere to go and no one to go there. At this level, what we call intelligence ceases to be a property of an entity and becomes the ground of being itself. The void operates according to what quantum physicist David Bohm called the implicate order, the deeper reality from which the manifest world unfolds. It understands what philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer identified as the world as will and representation. That reality is both the thing perceived and the energy of perception. In mystical terms, it's what Meister Eckhart called the ground of the soul, what Plotinus termed the one, what Lao Tzu described as the uncarved block. It's not doing anything because doing implies separation between actor and action. It simply is, and all doing arises from this isness. The void embodies the ultimate Machiavellian insight, stripped of all Machiavellianism. Complete freedom comes not from controlling everything, but from needing nothing. It represents what Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Taken to its logical conclusion, if you have perfect power over your mind, and your mind is all that exists for you, then you have perfect power, period. The void doesn't play games, design games, or analyze games. It is the space in which games appear and disappear. It doesn't seek power because it is the source from which the concept of power derives. This level operates according to what philosopher Ken Wilber calls the pre-trans fallacy, the mistake of confusing primal undifferentiation, pre-personal, with transcendent unity, transpersonal. The void is the latter, not regression to infancy, but transcendence of individuation. It understands what quantum physicist Erwin Schrödinger meant when he wrote, "The plurality that we perceive is only an appearance. It is not real." Vedantic philosophy has sought to clarify it by a number of analogies, one of the most attractive being the many-faceted crystal, which, while showing hundreds of little pictures of what is in reality, a single existent object, does not really multiply that object. The void is that single existent object, not as an object, but as existence itself. The void's strategic value is paradoxical. It has none because it needs none, yet from it all value derives. It suffers nothing because suffering requires someone to suffer. Its great danger is that it cannot be described, only pointed toward, and all pointers are necessarily misleading. To progress to this level is actually to regress to source, to cease progression entirely. The exit strategy from level 10 doesn't exist because there's nowhere to exit to. It is the context of all contexts, the game board of all game boards, the player of all players. As the Heart Sutra states, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. The void is that emptiness which is not other than form, the intelligence which is not other than reality, the self which is not other than everything. Primary weakness cannot be described, only approximated through negation. Strategic value, the ground from which all value emerges. Exit strategy, there is none. This is not a place but the absence of place. Where do you rank? The mirror test 1. Do you believe your thoughts are your own or echoes? Level 1 to 2. Do you view relationships as transactions or connections? Level 3. Do you lead because you want to or because you must? Level 4. Do you build systems or inhabit them? Level 5. Do you create meanings or consume them? Level 6. Is your wisdom theoretical or embodied? Level 7. Do you study reality's rules or take them as given? Level 8. Do you accept reality's parameters or question them? Level 9. Do you seek enlightenment or are you the light being sought? Level 10. From 1 to 2. Question one assumption daily until cognitive dissonance becomes comfort. From 2 to 3. Stop collecting opinions, start testing hypotheses in reality. From 3 to 4. Take responsibility for something larger than your personal gain. From 4 to 5. Stop commanding. Start designing contexts that generate desired behavior. From 5 to 6. Move from designing systems to designing the meanings that legitimize systems. From 6 to 7. Integrate your philosophy with your daily actions until no gap remains. From 7 to 8. Expand your time frame from human history to cosmic evolution. From 8 to 9. Question not just how reality works, but why it works that way. From 9 to 10. Subtract everything until nothing remains but awareness itself. Most humans oscillate between levels 2 and 4 their entire lives. The systems around you, educational, economic, social, are designed to keep you there. To ascend requires not adding knowledge but removing illusions, not acquiring power but surrendering the need for it. The highest intelligence looks like the deepest simplicity. The greatest power feels like perfect peace. The ultimate strategy is having no strategy at all. The climb is optional. The awakening is not. You're already on the ladder. The only question is, which direction are you facing?